So I want to welcome everybody to this presentation today, which is going to be on web-based conferencing tips and tricks. My name is Catanzano, and I am Professor and Vice Chair of Academic Affairs in the Department of Radiology, as well as the Residency Program Director, and I hold a position in the Office of Faculty Affairs as the Associate Director of Academic Career Development. For this talk, what I'm going to ask is that people hold their questions until the end of the presentation and then put their questions or comments into the chat window, and we will address them from there. So let's go ahead and get started. I have no disclosures for this particular meeting. How many of you feel like this when people ask you to give a web-based presentation or to run a web-based meeting? We've all been participants in these meetings, but it's very different as the presenter. And many of us don't know where to get started or what's involved. Do you send invites? How do you schedule it? Do you need a moderator? There's lots and lots of questions which go into this when you are the person giving the session. But don't panic. It's okay. We got you covered. We're going to go through a series of things in this talk, including discussing use cases for web-based conferencing, reviewing the components of a successful conference, describing some tips and tricks for success, and then some of the unexpected benefits that have come out of COVID with web-based conferencing. So we'll start first by discussing cases for web-based conferencing. And a lot of you have participated in these thus far due to the effects of the pandemic. And most of what I'm going to be speaking about today is based on the paper that you can find in the Journal of Computed-Aided Tomography that was borne out by the need to help people get through the pandemic with the use of these web-based conferences. And COVID really has propelled us very, very rapidly from the Stone Age in terms of technology and sharing of resources in an electronic format and being much more comfortable with in-person collaborative conversations and meetings to the Jetsons era. You know, we have had to very abruptly make this transition from traditional styles of meetings and sessions and education to a completely new and novel way of interacting with each other and conducting patient care and institutional need meetings. And I think that, frankly, we're never going to go back. I think that we have had a lot of gains in terms of efficiencies and some benefits from using these web-based conferences, and while there is still clearly a need and a desire to have in-person sessions and meetings again, I think that we will always have some component of these web-based conferencing as part of our daily lives. So when I talk about use cases, I think we can break this up into pandemic-related uses for web-based conferencing and non-pandemic related. And obviously the pandemic-related ones are the ones that came about very abruptly in the March, April era when the height of the pandemic was being felt across the world. And really, many of these will be familiar to you. So crisis operations, multidisciplinary patient care conferences, the use in telemedicine, and education. And we're going to walk through these one by one. So in terms of crisis operation, this has been a real boon from web-based conferencing for the standing up of command centers, the very rapid involvement of key members of organizational leadership to be able to meet with each other at very short notice without the need for physical in-person contact where they may have been in different regions of the health system. So they may have been in the East or the West, and they would have had to travel to a central location to have a meeting. Web-based conferencing really has obviated that need and allowed for very rapid, critical decision-making to occur in a timely manner in a centralized location with document sharing in web-based forms, either from Google Docs or from MS Teams, really allowing for centralized crisis management. It also has improved communication across organizations because you can allow for people to be in listen-only mode where they are not contributors to the meeting, but they can hear critical elements of decisions and decision-making that can be disseminated by a smaller group to the larger institution without the need for worrying about space constraints of physical room locales. And this is an example of what a huddle board might look like. And this actually comes from an MS Teams from a friend of mine. And you can see here that this is what they do in their stand-up of their command center, and it is a very rapid way for them to get an overall assessment of things that are going on in the institution or in the healthcare system that need to be addressed very rapidly without the need to hand out papers, figure out how to post different components of the information, It is all right there at a glance for them to look at. Let's move on to multidisciplinary patient care conferences. I think most of the people on this call have probably had experience with this. These are multidisciplinary care conferences, often in oncologic patients who require multiple disciplines to get together to discuss specific patient cases and to show their imaging findings, their pathology, talk about their clinical progress, and very vital for the care of these very complicated patients. Well, web-based conferencing has really improved the ability to have these in a very effective way. It has improved accessibility for all parts of the patient care team, not just the physicians who are involved in their care, but also for anyone who feels the need to be involved, so case managers, nursing staff, other trainees in the institution who would like to hear about these complex patient cares and find out how they are managed. It has really opened the door for people to be able to attend these conferences. And what's nice about it is that it really has allowed us to share images very easily, not only from radiology's perspective, but also endoscopic images can be easily shown. The pathology slides can be easily shown. It is much easier to share your screen than going back and forth between different projectors. So that has really improved the efficiency of these care conferences. The other real benefit, and speaking as a radiologist, I think that we really have learned to appreciate this in this context. It allows name recognition. So previously, you might have had a group of individuals in a room where some of the team members may have known each other and recognized each other, but you wouldn't necessarily know everyone, and particularly for us who sit in the dark, I think that it has allowed us to come out of the dark and put our names and faces together for people on the care teams. So that really has improved collegiality. How about telemedicine? I'm sure many of our clinical colleagues are very, very familiar with this through this whole pandemic. So there was obviously an urgent need and an increased demand to have telemedicine services throughout health systems during the height of the pandemic. And it has really allowed health systems to expand their services and expand their reach to patients who are unable or unwilling to come into a physical location such as an office or the hospital and to get the care that they need. The one caveat to that I will highlight is that it really, again, underscores healthcare disparity that we see so readily throughout all of our healthcare provisions, because the same patients that have struggled getting to appointments, either because they have no public transportation, they are too ill to come to the meetings or the appointments, they also struggle with access to the equipment that they need for these televisits. So they may not have cell phone access, they may not have an iPad, they may not have internet service. And so it just underscores the need for attention to these healthcare disparities. And then finally, more in my wheelhouse is the educational aspect. We had to very, very abruptly across all health systems change the way that we deliver medical education to our trainees, medical students, residents, fellows, and the like. And that required us to completely change the way we provided both bedside education or workstation education into a different model. And the web-based conferencing has really allowed us to do that in non-standard, non-traditional ways. And so we have started to provide our didactic lectures in this web-based format. So you can provide a traditional lecture like this one. You can do a flipped classroom approach where you actually provide the trainees or the learners with the material in advance of this session and then allow them to have a robust discussion on the material at the time of the live event. You can also pre-record a talk like we are recording this one, send it out or show it at the time of the live session, and then have a live Q&A so that you have some interaction with the speaker. Of course, this is not without its own challenges, and the ones that we have seen truly are, like everything else, lack of interaction and loss of interest. And we'll address a little bit of this later with how we may be able to mitigate against that. Well, how about non-pandemic related? Hopefully, at some point, this will end. And when it does, what can we use web conferencing for? And I would argue that these are probably three of the biggest. Cross-country or international collaboration for academic pursuits, telehealth again, and then extra-institutional work groups such as national societies and NIH study groups. So if we look at the cross-country or international collaboration, what has this allowed? It has really allowed for wide open communication and interaction with people that you would not necessarily have had the opportunity to work with side by side at your own institution or even at the national level. You would now have the opportunity to collaborate with your peers in different countries, different states, different institutions within your own state. It allows for very, very rapid setup of meetings that will allow brainstorming to occur. You can check in on the progress of certain things. It allows for real think tanks to have started to develop. And one of the big challenges with that, because it does allow for such international collaboration, is figuring out different time zones. And people have chosen to address this in different ways. So you can choose to record an informational session and then send it out to people. You can have different meetings, meeting different time zones where you discuss the same topics that you have with smaller groups. And then you can bring different sessions together at a mutually conducive time, or as much as mutually conducive time as you can get. In terms of telehealth, ditto what we were just talking about. I think that institutions are very interested and very committed to expanding their telehealth offerings, and not even just in the clinical arena where we typically see it. We have started to see it in other specialties. There are telepsychiatry visits, telepathology, teleradiology, where there are direct patient-facing encounters. So I think that this will continue long after the pandemic has ended. And then extra-institutional work groups are very similar to what we discussed before. You can work with someone at a different institution on a particular project or a research activity or guidelines for policy and procedure, and it really does improve the efficiency and the ease of communication. I will put out the caveat that you should be very aware of the time suck that these groups entail. So you have to be a little bit self-protective in terms of making sure that your commitments to these groups, which all sound fantastic and wonderful and give you tremendous academic opportunities, they can take over your life. And you have to be a little bit careful that you're not extending your workday beyond what is reasonable or mentally healthy for your own welfare. Okay, so let's look at the components of a successful conference. What is it that will help us get from failure to success and making sure that our sessions go off as smoothly as possible? Well, the first thing that you need to do is to identify who you're going to have as participants of your meeting, session, talk, whatever it is, and then you have to figure out a schedule of a time. It's very easy in small groups to just go back and forth with email, but once you have more than 3 or 4 people, it gets very unwieldy to have this exchange of scheduling suggestions through an email or a phone-based method. So what I think is really helpful is some of these platforms that are out there, and I particularly like Doodle.com. You can send out these polls to anyone that you have identified as a potential participant in your session and give them a slate of times and dates where you are available as the host. And what's nice about it is that people just fill this in at their own time period, and depending on which version, the free versions will often just tell you, hey, this is the best time. Your meeting date should be Thursday at 6 a.m. The ones that have some cost to it, including Doodle, will allow you to send reminders like, hey, you haven't finished this, or you haven't filled out this Doodle poll, go ahead and remember to fill it out, or do follow-ups to remind people that they have a scheduled meeting once the schedule is set. There are other ones like the Outlook Scheduling Assistant. I personally don't like this one and don't use it, so don't ask me about it. I don't know how to use it. This does not work particularly well for those of us who are providers in healthcare. What tends to happen is that people who have access to our calendar will see empty slots and assume that you are free, even if you're on a clinical rotation. And so while we know that we are not available on a Monday because we're on the PEDS rotation, somebody who has access to your calendar or who can see it across the system may not recognize that. So you will find these meetings on your calendar randomly, and now you have commitments that you may not necessarily be able to keep. So I would caution people about using this one. I think that others like Doodle Poll are actually far better to be able to consistently figure out when people are actually available. And then once you have this set up, send reminders. And in general, it's a good idea to send it 1 week and then 2 weeks and 1 week in advance of the meeting. And I always would suggest including the link to the web browser in it, because people are going to lose this in their emails. It's going to get filed down as emails come in. So sending the reminder with the link is always a really good idea. The other thing that you should send with the reminders are agendas if you have them. And one thing that I think is particularly helpful for agendas, especially on these web-based calls, is to break your agenda down into these different areas. So if you put things in an informational bucket, it means to people that you're going to tell them something that they don't necessarily have to act on, but they need to know about. The discussion means that, hey, you're actually going to have to participate in some part of this conference or this conversation. And the decision means that you have to have some actionable item that you're going to make a decision about during this meeting. And by doing it this way, I think it really nicely helps people recognize that they will need to participate and be actively involved in the session. So it is one way to help garner some accountability for interacting with the speaker. Next, you need to make sure that you are using a platform that is reliable, meets the needs of the number of people that you're planning to have on your session, and that you as the speaker are comfortable using. We've all dialed into WebEx 1,000 times, but if we don't use it routinely to give the conference, I think it can be very much of a surprise as people are setting things up to give the talk or to give the meeting, and it can lead to some confusion and to some real challenges. So make yourself comfortable, play with it beforehand, make sure you know where all the buttons are. There are lots and lots and lots of these out there. The one thing that we in healthcare need to remember is that any one that we use should be Hipaa compliant. While we may not always be sharing data, you just never know what could be showing up on your screen somewhere that you weren't aware of or that you accidentally shared. And so whatever server or company you're using for your web-based platforms, you need to make sure in the healthcare setting that it is Hipaa compliant. Fortunately for us, we use WebEx here, which is secure and Hipaa compliant, unlike some of the others, such as Zoom. And then finally, for success, we need to worry about IT-related issues, everyone's favorite. So, like I mentioned, you need to make sure that whatever web-based platform you're using is reliable, that it is appropriate for the number of people that you have involved in your session, and that it is robust. You also need to make sure that you as the speaker or you as a participant have adequate Wi-Fi and bandwidth to be able to conduct the meeting without losing your signal during part of it. You may need to move to a different part of your office or your room. If you have a background on, that can actually suck out the bandwidth. So if you're finding that you're glitching in and out with either your sound or your photo, you may want to turn off your backgrounds, as it will suck out your bandwidth. And then finally, when you're presenting, you need to make sure that what you have on your slides is visible reasonably across all manner of devices, because we know that people are going to log in from radiology workstations. They're going to log in from their laptops or their desktops or their cell phones. And so you need to make sure that they are able to see all of your screen and at a size where it is actually visible and intelligible to them. So those are things you want to check out before you actually start your presentation. All right, let's move on to some tips and tricks, which I'm sure is what everyone is really, really interested in, so that they can make sure that they are doing things as well as possible. Like I did at the beginning of this, I went over the rules of the road. I told everyone that we were going to be muting them on entry. We went through how I expected interaction, which is going to be a chat function at the end of the presentation so that I'm not distracted by chats coming up. You should remind people to log in with either their audio or their phone. And the reason for that is that people don't realize when they're having trouble getting onto their desktop or their laptop or whatever, and they're also calling in because they can't hear, it sets up a sound arc and you get that terrible feedback. So they need to shut off the volume on one of those two or log in from only one of those devices. You should tell people in advance if you want them to put on their cameras to have the interactive component. You know, this is especially useful in the education sphere where learners often like to hide. So you should let them know in advance that they should be prepared to have a device connected that has some form of a camera. Cell phones have them, iPads have them, so there's really very little excuse these days to not have a device available with a camera. As the speaker, you want to test the connection and the equipment in advance. to make sure that things are working. So, for instance, what we did with this session is that we set it up so that I could come on 15 minutes in advance with Elaine and test and make sure that I knew which monitor my PowerPoint was going to project to and that I could work out any bugs in the system and to make sure that she could hear me. So you want to do that in advance so that you're not fumbling around as you are coming on. One thing that actually came up this morning in our grand rounds was that because of all of the phishing issues, there are a lot of institutions that have completely locked down most of their access, and so that's something that you may not know until the day, and so you would just have to ask people to have patience if you're struggling to get your session to start or to be able to share your screen with them. The other thing you want to do is make sure that you close all of the applications on your computer so that they don't suddenly pop up or you accidentally share something. I think this is especially true with email, where little boxes show up in the bottom of your screen unexpectedly, and you never know what's going to be there, and it can be very distracting to you as a speaker. In terms of the interaction, we've already sort of talked about this. You want to choose your method in advance, and different platforms will have different ways to be able to have people interact with them. So some of them will only have a chat function. Others will have a raise hand function or self-unmute. Some of them have cute little emojis that you can clap for somebody if you think that what they're saying makes sense while you're muted. Again, muting participants if the noise or feedback is a problem, making clear at the beginning and then reinforcing how you want the interaction to occur. And then if you'll notice, some people will often have just their EN or PN numbers show up, or caller, call-in user, whatever. Some of the platforms will allow you as the host to rename that call-in user, and that can be very helpful if you want to be able to have more interactions and see who you're speaking to. Instead of saying, hey, EN number 67051, I want you to answer this question, when you don't actually know who's on the other end of the line. Having a moderator can be very helpful. This person will typically be the person who screens the participant window to make sure that nobody has accidentally or purposely unmuted themselves. They will monitor the chat box to see if there's anything that the speaker needs to know. For instance, hey, I can't hear you. That person will communicate that to the speaker. You need to be specific with the moderator of what your expectation of their role will be. So you have to tell them in advance, I need you to monitor the chat window. I want you to monitor that anybody has unmuted so that you can remute them as soon as they take that off. And then practice with them when that's possible. And this is what I call the I really should have thought of that comments, things that have come up after we had published the paper that you just didn't think of but are really important and can be a death sentence to any of your sessions. You need to make sure that somebody on the call has the host key. This is particularly true of WebEx. So if you are not the host or you don't have the host key, you may not have the ability to share your screen. Imagine that if you were giving this presentation and you couldn't share the screen with all your slides. That would be a very challenging presentation to do. You also want to know where all the buttons are. So you need to know where the mute all button is, particularly if there's that feedback loop. You need to make sure you know where the record button is. You need to know where the screen share button is, and you also need to be aware that it will give you lots of options, especially if you have more than one screen. Make sure you are sharing the right screen. You do not want to accidentally be sharing photos of your kid's Halloween costume, for instance. So make sure that when you are sharing the screen, it is the correct one. And this is particularly important if you might have patient care information up on a different monitor. You don't want to accidentally share some confidential information. Other things that you need to be aware of is that you need to have the meeting invitation and the link to it, and you need to make sure that it is the correct one. I recently discovered when I gave this talk for the remote summit for the institution that I needed to register for the conference. I've never had to do that as a speaker, and so it was very surprising to me 10 minutes before when I was trying the meeting invitation that I had on my calendar that it just didn't work. So there are going to be things like that that come up. Sometimes you can't predict them, but try your best to be aware of things that have occurred so that you can watch out for them in the next time. Also check your login. I can't tell you the number of times when I have from home used Zoom for a national meeting and showed up as Static Comics, which is my son's comic book that he's trying to make, or one of my kids' names. It can be really embarrassing. I think people understand that, but make sure that you check in advance that you are using yourself and your own login. And if you don't realize it, you better know where you can rename yourself on that particular platform, because you'll save yourself some embarrassment that way. Some tips for engagement. Like we mentioned, you want to encourage camera use. We have discussed in the residency program the use of personal devices. We were concerned about some feedback loops, but if everybody has headphones on, it's really not a challenge, and it doesn't allow people to hide that way. It's amazing to me how a 6'5" resident can tuck himself in the corner of a conference room during a noon conference and not be visible to you as the speaker, even though they're very, very tall. By putting their cameras on and using personal devices, you take away some of that, so it's much harder for them to hide. Assigning tasks to participants can also be helpful to get them to be engaged. So like we were talking about with the agendas, if you say, we're going to have a discussion on this, you, Ken, are going to participate in it, they know that they should be staying aware and engaged throughout the whole session or the whole meeting. And then also setting expectations of the participants as you are speaking can be very helpful. So I have been known to, at meetings, say, if I don't hear any volunteers for this, I'm going to volunteer you that you're going to do it. So the threat of public shaming can often be helpful to get people to be engaged. The other things that can be helpful are keeping your participant pane open. So it lets you interact, and I'm looking to the right because it's on my second screen, so it lets me see who's actually paying attention to me and who's not, if they have their cameras on, which most of us do not for this, but it lets me see who's actually there, and I can pick somebody's name and say, I'm going to just pick somebody, Julio, can you please tell me what you think of this plan? So it allows me to see who's on the call and to have them, give them an opportunity to be engaged. The other thing, and I think that this is a real struggle for people, and I have clearly not perfected this, is the concept of speaking into the camera. So as a speaker, my tendency is going to be to look at the screen so I know what I'm going to say based on what's on my slides. That to you looks like I'm just looking down. What I really should be doing, and if I were running a meeting, I would be much more likely to do this, is actually to look into the camera. And so you can see the difference. When I'm looking in the camera, it looks like I'm speaking to you, and that's much more engaging than somebody looking down at their slides. As I said, I have not perfected that one, but I am working on it. And then the chat function, I think, is particularly helpful for people like me who are introverts and tend to be very quiet unless we are hosting an event. If I have something to say, I may not, particularly in an in-person setting, I may not actually say it because I feel very uncomfortable speaking out in a group. But the chat function has actually been very beneficial for people who tend to be quiet in meetings because it allows them to share their thoughts without the peer pressure or the anxiety of actually speaking in public, which is the #1 fear for people worldwide, believe it or not. So I think that that is a really positive thing that has occurred with these web-based conferences. Few other things for engagement. You can record the sessions for future use. So if people have found parts of this or any talk useful, you can then go ahead and record it and save it somewhere, and they can use it to refer back to, so that may keep them engaged in the topic. You can also use it for asynchronous viewing. If we remember back to when we were talking about the flipped classroom, where you can send out the information either by a flipped classroom where you're sending them the video to watch beforehand and then engaging in the robust discussion. That can be very helpful. And then leave them laughing. You know, these are difficult times, and I think people always appreciate a little bit of levity, and if you can poke fun at yourself, then I think you should do it. You really don't want to sound like humdrum doom and gloom. I think you really need to keep people engaged by being funny. Remember Murphy's Law. I went to school in Ireland. I'm very familiar with Murphy's Law, and I live it. Things are going to go wrong. If you do enough of these, either as a participant or someone who is hosting the event, something will happen. And there's nothing you can do about that. What you have to do is just don't panic. I think most people in this time are very understanding of the struggles that we are having. They realize that you're not purposely trying to screw something up and the technology is just working against you. It'll be fine. But it's not going to stop you from being totally stressed out in the moment or from being really embarrassed. But it is okay. And then finally, I want to round out the talk by speaking about some of the unexpected benefits of COVID and the need for this web conferencing. Did I just say benefits? Yes, I did. Seriously? Yes. Yes, I did. There are actually some benefits to having been forced to very precipitously move into this new virtual reality that we're all in. And a lot of these we've already discussed. So there is improved accessibility. We have been much better communicators with each other and with people outside of our small sphere of in-person contact. So we are much better at communicating with people at the national level. We can have improved interaction. We share information much better. I will tell you from a meeting attendance perspective, we have never had so many faculty members at our faculty meetings as we had once we went virtual, because we lowered the barrier to entry for people not able to be at the main campus for a 7 o'clock meeting if they were at one of the other institutions. So that has been a tremendous boon to improving attendance, participation, and information sharing within the department. The collaboration has been phenomenal. I think if you leverage different social media with web-based conferencing, you can be very successful in raising your national profile. I will tell you that I had this idea about multi-generational communication because I was finding with my residents that the way that I would typically communicate as a Gen X was not necessarily the way that they were understanding me, because their frame of reference is different based on their generation. So I put out a call on Twitter, say, hey, anybody interested in collaborating with me to write this paper? And sure enough, I had a whole bunch of people, and we were able to leverage web-based conferencing to have a in-person virtual conversation to go through check-in points, work on the outline, craft the writing of it. When it didn't get accepted in the first place, we had another meeting to talk about how we would be able to change it or address the reviewers' comments, and we ultimately were successful in getting it published. Asynchronous information sharing, like we were talking about with different time zones, has also been beneficial, so that you can record these meetings and then just put them up at a different time zone for a short Q&A where it doesn't involve everybody being on the conference call again. The things that have decreased but have actually been a good thing are the anonymity. Now more people can be included in these meetings and sessions, and so we have actually increased our net to capture people who may have been marginalized before, particularly if they are often at different sites and can't be involved in direct in-person meetings. This has really helped them. Our meetings have gotten shorter. You'll find that we're now at 34 minutes and we're coming to the conclusion of the talk. We have really improved how we use our time so that we can contribute the same amount of information and knowledge, but in a much shorter time span. And it's been much easier to schedule meetings with these web-based platforms, like using Doodle. It's much, much quicker for us to figure out when we can have a meeting and when we can't than it traditionally had been. Challenges are, like everything else COVID, to be expected. We've mentioned time zones. The incorrect links can really be challenging and very stressful, particularly to you as the presenter if you don't get the right link to give your talk. Login difficulties are rife. One thing I will tell you, when you get Zoom rejected because you have your kids' static comics up, try a different device. That's one thing I found. If you actually log in from your cell phone when your home computer has been ejected, it will allow you to do it because it doesn't recognize that that is the same person trying to log in. Compliance has become problematic, as you see from just looking at the participant list here. Just look at your screen. Very few people have their cameras on. They're tired. It's hard to keep people's energy up to want to be seen during these sessions when they could be checking their email over here while still sort of listening. So, we recognize that this is going to happen, particularly as the pandemic wears on, but it is a challenge. The self-muting has also surprisingly become a challenge. Everyone gets muted, and then somehow they forget and they unmute themselves, and you can hear people ordering their breakfast at McDonald's. So they can be very entertaining, but not necessarily helpful to you when you are running a meeting. And then the lack of engagement we've already touched on, so giving tasks can really help that. A couple of cautionary things. Zoom bombing is a thing, so you've probably all heard about this term. It's when someone who is not a participant in your meeting or an invited participant somehow takes control of your meeting and is able to share content that is often inappropriate. There have been lots of reports in the news about second graders having been flashed by a high school teenager who Zoom bombed their conference. So that's a real thing, and you need to be aware of it. We've talked about Zoom rejection, where you get kicked out of a meeting and then struggle to get back into it. And I want to spend a minute or two really talking about this, which is Zoom fatigue or web platform fatigue. It is real. And I mentioned it a little bit before, where your days, which are already long to begin with, in general, most of us probably have a 10 to 11-hour day. If you're on call, maybe you have a 15-hour day. Your days get much, much longer and more packed as you are involved in all of these calls. So if you are on committees at an institution, or you are a program director, or you are involved in societies at the national level, or you are working on papers with people, it is very easy to give in to the temptation to say, oh, sure, I can be at that web-based meeting at 7 p.m. after I started work at 7 a.m. Your days get really, really long, and you tend to start marginalizing parts of your personal life, which is not good for overall wellness for yourself or for the people that you are actually tasked to supervise. The back-to-back meetings, which now are possible because you don't have to leave your office to have them, have actually become much more problematic, because where you might have been able to walk down the hall to a different meeting location previously and taken that 5 minutes to just reset your mind frame, clear your thoughts, and be ready and prepared to be fully engaged with the next meeting. We don't have that anymore. So you're just sitting at your kitchen table, or you're standing at your standing desk, or you're sitting in your office, and you just have meeting after meeting after meeting with no time to process or to reflect on things or to have downtime. And particularly for introverts, and this is a whole other school of psychology, but introverts really need that time to be quiet and not engaged, to really reflect on things that they have interacted with and to think about how they should respond to different situations. And this has been a real challenge, and it is very, very fatiguing for people. And finally, just two other points of caution, one of which we've already touched on, which is Hipaa compliance. Make sure that you are not accidentally using a web-based platform that is not compliant, or that you are not accidentally sharing HIPAA-protected information by showing the wrong screen. And then just a word about copyright. If you are planning to record a session that you're giving like this, there is a whole different arena of copyright law that will potentially preclude you from sharing the information more widely on the web because of copyright. And I don't have time to get into that, but it is something that if you are considering recording some of these sessions or recording a lecture that you're giving and then putting it up on your YouTube channel, that you may want to be aware of, because you could have copyright infringement and not even be aware of it. And apparently these bars that come across the bottom stop you from moving your slide forward. We have reached the end. I think that this image very nicely sums up the way I have been feeling these days, which is very much overwhelmed by all of the web-based meetings that we have to have. But hopefully you have found this somewhat entertaining and helpful to you.